When Link enters a grotto, the game records the scene he came from and his coordinates so that it can put him back when he exits. You can see this in action. I have Link's coordinates on screen, and when I enter this grotto, they'll be copied to those stored values. And you can see that these are actually having some effect. For instance, if I increase the stored height a bunch, then Link will pop out way above the ground. Something to note is that when I started out, the stored coordinates were all 0. So that means that if we had a way to exit a grotto without ever entering a grotto to set those values, we would be taken somewhere unintended. In order to actually do this, I've set up Follower's Wind on Child's B button, and I'm going to set it here in Shadow Temple, right in this Truth Spinner room. And then I'm going to need to make my way to Zelda's Courtyard. Alright, so here I am visiting Zelda, and we're going to have to do a few things to get the result we want. So while that's going on, this is probably a good time to discuss the way things work in Majora's Mask, because people probably wonder why Majora's Mask can do grotto alt exits, right? You might have seen that's the way speedrunners get to Deku Palace. That's because in Majora's Mask, some of the grottos have set exits, so the game will always put you in a certain place when you leave that grotto. The ones in Deku Palace are included in that, so you can start in any grotto and get to Deku Palace that way. OoT does not have any of those grottos, so anytime you leave a grotto in this game, you will show up at your stored coordinates. So it's a little harder to take advantage of the grotto system. Okay, so now we're ready to do a little wrong warp here, and you might have guessed that this is going to put us into a grotto. So we've entered a grotto. Our stored coordinates are still zeroed out from when we came from file select, and now we're going to exit the grotto. What's going to happen? Our game crashed. It turns out BizHawk doesn't really like the entrance that we were trying to load, but VC doesn't have that same problem. It has a slightly different problem. So here I've set up the same thing. I've used cheats to enter this grotto without ever actually entering any grotto after coming from file select. And when I exit, this happens. Now I can't move, I can't use any items, but luckily I can still pause, and you can actually see that we're in Deku Tree. And since I can pause, I can save warp. And indeed, it's a fast way to get to Deku Tree, which shouldn't be surprising because the entrance value was zeroed when we came from file select, and Deku Tree is entrance 0. So we got a wrong warp to Deku Tree. That's pretty cool, but it's not the end of the story. Check out what happens if I play a warp song. In particular, pay attention to the stored grotto exit address. So when you use a warp song, it actually writes the place that it takes you to the stored grotto exit. But as you can see, it doesn't change the stored coordinates. So what happens if we do that same trick, wrong warp into a grotto and leave, after we've played a warp song? So again, I've wrong warped into this grotto, but this time I played Prelude beforehand. So now, what happens if we exit this grotto? Well, we end up back in Temple of Time, and we get the warp song animation, but we're at our stored grotto coordinates, which were still 0. So we end up warping to 0, 0, 0 in the Temple of Time, which just happens to be at the Master Sword pedestal, and conveniently behind the Door of Time. But since playing a warp song didn't change the stored coordinates, we can actually do some more interesting combinations as well. For instance, I can enter this grotto, setting my coordinates to some values. Then playing a warp song will change my stored grotto exit. So now if we do the wrong warp again with these stored values, and we exit the grotto, maybe, there it is, we end up in Colossus, and we're up here, and we're also invisible. We can grab this heart piece. We have this fun glitch that can also happen if you, for instance, play a warp song while dead. And you can have all kinds of fun with first-person view because your camera is locked back where it's supposed to be, at the warp pedestal.